to the Fundación Rafael del Pino for stepping in after the meeting that we held in February. Remember, Russians and Ukrainians addressing these very important issues, civil society talking about the facts in Ukraine as of 2022. So thank you, as I say, for organizing this roundtable by bringing two specialists who are well-known and who are, I assure you, absolutely stellar. Now, the approach this afternoon is not justice or peace. It's not one or the other. We will be hearing Philippe Sands, who defends justice no matter what, no matter where, and Mark Freeman is for peace, whatever it may cost, without thinking about the values of democratic values, but they both are experts in that specific field. And Philippe Sands is a lawyer. He has been in international courts of law. He was very important in the Pinochet case in London, and Mark Freeman has been everywhere. All of the more recent peace processes, I would say, in Colombia. So they have this experience, and all I'm going to do is broach those essential issues so that they then afterwards can talk very, very freely, obviously. Now, this is a dilemma, and here let me say, if we have to choose one or the other, the fact of the matter is all of these processes where an authoritarian regime is being left behind, where there is transition from a dictatorship to democracy, this dilemma comes to the forefront. If we want to leave dictatorship behind, we have got to bite the bullet and accept that there will be no justice crime-wise. We have got to leave the victims a little bit on the sidelines for the benefit of society, so that society can evolve and become a democracy. The price of democracy is justice. That's what you pay, especially criminal justice. Now, if it is armed conflict, especially internal ones, doubtless the worst war of all is a civil war. Well, this is the same dilemma. You need to choose. You need to say, I will forego justice in order to attain peace. Now, in recent history, we don't need to go back centuries, but we have crystal clear examples as to how, sometimes successfully, other times not that successfully, how we have tried to strike a balance between those two values, because in democratic societies, peace and justice are a must. But let's begin by, without going into Ukraine, without talking about Putin, without talking about this weekend's wild weekend, the war in Ukraine, let's talk about transitions, as I say, and let's compare, because we're comparing extremes, the transición in Spain and the transition in Argentina. In Spain, la transición, justice, definitely criminal justice, was left on the sidelines because it was deemed that this was essential for amnesty, for consensus that would allow for the celebration of free elections after 40 years of dictatorship and the approval of the Constitution. Zero justice, 100% democracy. In the case of Argentina, it's au contraire. From then and until today, there are criminal cases against those responsible military, civilians, doctors who stole babies, entrepreneurs, and there were ups and downs, of course, but in Argentina, it's fair to say 100% democracy, but 100% justice, sort of. So these two examples, how do they help us understand how important the value of justice is? But then that shifting yardstick, which we're tired of seeing, but it is how the world works. This allows us to understand clearly that international justice is always subject to conditions. That is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a fact that it is conditioned by political imperatives. Sometimes the UN Security Council decides to establish ad hoc courts. This is the case of Yugoslavia, this is the case of Rwanda, or not. This is the case of Guatemala, where after 36 years of civil war, Well, there was, in fact, a genocide which has as yet not been judged. And the ICJ decided, existing already, but the UN decided to send on the Libyan situation, but not the Syrian situation. Why this double yardstick? Well, for political reasons, because this is what happens in the international sphere. It is a kind of principle of opportunity whereby the possibility of ensuring that there is no more attack is what encourages politicians to sacrifice justice in favor of peace, and other times it is justice that prevails. And this is what happens in Yugoslavia. You know that court was created in 1993, and shortly after, negotiations were undertaken which resulted in the Dayton Accords, and the existence proper of the court for the former Yugoslavia was another element. At the end of the day, it was decided to not dissolve the court, but Milosevic was lucky when he accepted signing the Dayton Accords. He was immune personally, and as a representative of the state, could not foresee that after Kosovo, he would no longer be head of state and would be delivered, together with Karadzic and Vladik, delivered into the court's hands. Again, there was negotiation, and again, there the decision was taken to defend it. So peace was compatible with the proceedings against these persons who had committed these crimes in former Yugoslavia. Now we have more recent examples, such as Colombia. Again, the crimes were terrible. There is an estimate of 65,000 persons accountable for crimes, kidnapping, torture, murder, and nevertheless, it was possible to achieve that peace negotiation, if not guaranteeing justice in a traditional sense, but restorative justice, which allowed for victims to be placed at the heart of the system. Mark knows very much about this, and this is what allowed the country to put an end to the conflict, which was already 50 years ongoing with the FARC, and paved the way to the negotiations which are currently underway with other armed groups. So in Yugoslavia, negotiation which does not forego justice, and in any case, peace in Colombia. Peace, yes, but sacrificing justice for those, at least, who are subject to that special legislation, over 10,000 persons. So the mission for that special court is overwhelming, if only because of the many, many crimes that they will have to see, be it for restoration or retribution. And then we have the International Court of Justice. It has not done a great job over the past 20 years of existence, again because of those political imperatives which make it difficult for the achievement expected as the achievement sought. The court was established in 1998 when the Rome Statute was approved, but it only began to function in 2002, which was literally months after 9/11, which of course changed the world. There had been consensus for a decade in the international community, and things changed overnight. Everything was confrontational, and again, justice is left to take second place after other demands. ICJ, if we think about Ukraine, if we think about that accountability with regards to President Putin, has not been successful in general terms when it comes to seeing important parties, especially in the case of heads of state, persons who have been heads of state. In the case of Omar al-Bashir, remember Darfur, again, that had been referred to the International Court of Justice. A warrant was issued. It's been 10 years. He was a head of state. now he's no longer, and it's been impossible. He has not been delivered to the International Court of Justice, therefore has not been judged. Muammar al-Gaddafi, again, another case, but was executed in those uprisings that resulted after his fall from power. And then another two important cases which would lead to a very different conversation. The president of Kenya, who was denounced, and the court had to put an end to it. In the case of Laurent Gbagbo, the president of Cote d'Ivoire, who was judged and absolved. It's very difficult to determine, without a real burden of proof, what the responsibility and accountability is of heads of state who are at a great distance from the crimes that take place on the street. So it's necessary to have that burden of proof. So we have the ICJ. It seems to have a double yardstick. It could happen again in the Ukraine. If we compare with Uganda and Colombia, again there was investigation underway. Uganda, a preliminary examination. In the case of Colombia, in Colombia it was allowed for peace negotiations to forge on ahead without actually issuing that award. In the case of Uganda, the Lord's Army leaders were in fact sought by the law. So this is the debate that is undergoing. Peace or justice, both, one, the other. Do we negotiate? Do we not negotiate? And this brings us to Ukraine now. President Vladimir Putin of Russia, when he was prime minister, remember the Chechnya war, over 60,000 lives lost, Grozny was razed, and the international community, apart from protesting, apart from some diplomatic complaints, did not do much else. In 2008, he invaded two Russian or pro-Russian provinces in Georgia, and there were no consequences there either. And those are independent, de facto independent, or satellites of Moscow, but the situation is now what it was back then. In 2014, there was a reaction to the revolution of Maidan, which had citizens taking to the streets but peacefully. And as you know, President Putin decided to unilaterally annex the territory of the Crimea, and he began to provide support in a very obvious way, possible insurrection which resulted in Donbass in those territories, and nothing much happened then either. In 2015, he decided to provide assistance to Bashar al-Assad with 60,000 soldiers, 40,000 flights, no consequences for Putin. And in 2022, perhaps misreading a green light to do as he would, using armed forces against territories in his own country or in other countries, he decided to invade Ukraine. So this is the situation. We know that in Ukraine now, in Bucha, Mariupol, theaters, schools, hospitals, children, crimes of war have been committed. We imagine that crimes against humanity have also been committed, and President Putin would be accountable, he would be responsible, and it would be exactly the same difficulty, transforming what is undeniably a political accountability into a criminal one. So the prosecutor will have to say, but there is another crime, and there is no court for that. The Charter of the UN only allows for the use of force in cases of legitimate defense when a state has been attacked. Of course, that state will have the right to defend. And we will see that preventive defense, we will see in the face of an imminent attack. That is the explanation given in 2003, the Iraq War, and President Putin himself has said that he needed to prevent the genocide which the Ukrainian authorities were planning against Russians in Ukraine, but the international community has a cornerstone, and that is a cornerstone of the UN, says that charter, which says that only after authorization or only in the case of legitimate defense. It seems obvious that in the cases of Crimea, Donbass, Syria, among others, it's obvious that Russia was not threatened. There was no obvious threat. It is debatable whether there was a potential threat of genocide. It was rather Ukrainians who were originally Russian. But anyways, that was his argument, and thus we see that illegitimate use by a sovereign state against another sovereign state. And this crime is an orphan. There's no court. The ICJ cannot know of a possible crime of aggression by the Russian Federation against Russia after 2022, and there is no other court. They could attempt to do so in court in Ukraine, but there's no political clout to launch proceedings along those lines. Philippe Sands, among others, has recommended the creation of a special court, an ad hoc court, to judge the crimes of aggression as committed by the Russian Federation, but this is one of the items on the wish list of the international community. For the time being, there is no resolution, and there does not seem to be a resolution on its way. And then, could there be a transitional justice in Ukraine? If you think about the different communities, Ukrainians, Russophiles, and so on, because the problem of Crimea, the problem of Donbass, was a pre-existing problem. Crimea had been occupied by the Tartars and Donbass by the Cossacks, and it was in the days of Stalin, and we're not going to talk about Stalin now, that's for St. Peter to discuss. Those populations were sent off to Siberia, and Russians were then brought to those parts of the country for repopulation purposes. So those were the traditions, and they demanded autonomy. And actually in the peace accords upheld by the European Union in 2014, 2015, and by the CSCE, it was decided that those territories would actually become autonomous, similar to what we have in Spain with our 17 comunidades autónomas, in order to pacify and make coexistence possible between Russians and Ukrainians on Ukrainian soil. The war, of course, has resulted in everything being blown to smithereens, including the Minsk Accords. So that's where we are. Nobody knows what's going to happen. What we've seen in the past weekend allows us to understand that maybe Putin, we thought that maybe he would die in his bed, as Stalin did. It maybe is more and more similar to Milosevic. So I'm going to give the floor to our guests so that they can tell us how they interpret this dilemma, peace and or justice, and specifically peace and or justice in Ukraine. Gentlemen, you have the floor.
¿Qué es el orden? ¿Quién quiere? Yeah? Okay, all right. Por orden alfabético.
In alphabetical order, we'll have Mark start.
Much, Carlos. Thank you to the foundation, and thank you to all of you for joining us today, and my co-panelist Philippe. I suppose, there's one central point that I would wish to make in the spirit of debate, which is that the actions we take today and tomorrow in the area of accountability or criminal justice, that it would be wise if we take them in a way that allows the maximum possibility of peace through negotiation in future. I would pick up from exactly what Carlos just said, which is that we don't know how this war is going to end. I was telling Carlos just before in the waiting room how I remember very well in the case of Syria, how approximately 10 years ago, in a cabinet room meeting of the government, there was a bomb, and several people were killed, and there were articles for weeks, probably months, counting down the end of Assad, and here we are 10 years later. It's not to say that, I mean, I suppose it's just, again, it's just a general point that we have to be mindful of this balancing act and keep that part of the big picture in our minds in the actions we take today in the area of accountability and criminal justice. And maybe just on a personal note, before I come to Ukraine specifically, I began my career in the area of international human rights law. And I was fortunate that early on, I became involved with a field that hadn't even been born yet, which today is called transitional justice. Carlos alluded to it a little bit, because I think there was a tendency, at the time I was a law student, to think about two very extreme choices, that there would either be criminal accountability or total impunity. And the basic idea of transitional justice, which I think is relevant to this debate today, is that there are actually many choices in between those two extremes. Again, Carlos referred to some of the sort of tools or mechanisms that are part of that field, which really only took form really in the 1990s, I would say, properly, which involve things like truth and reconciliation commissions, reparations for victims, and actually an enormous amount of creativity that today is part of how we handle these questions of justice inside of peace negotiations. And that's the other personal point that I wanted to share. I mean, the hardest work I've done in my career, hardest intellectually, hardest ethically, hardest legally, has been inside of peace negotiations, including actually in Minsk. I went back and forth between Barcelona, where my institute is headquartered, which is a privilege, I should say, and Minsk, where there were negotiations in relation to the Minsk Accords, which were two-page documents signed in 2014 and 2015. Again, Carlos referred to them. But what do those documents say about justice? These were endorsed by no less than the EU and its member states, the OSCE, which was mediating. It says absolutely nothing, actually, about accountability or justice. It just says that there will be an amnesty. And it was actually unclear to the parties themselves what that might mean. The point of the Minsk talks was to think about this. And at the same time, I was also going back and forth. It was a very exhausting period in my life between that process, which was endorsed by the EU, which basically endorsed this amnesty, the details to be worked out in Minsk, and Havana, where the Colombian government was negotiating with the FARC based on the premise that there would only be peace if there would also be some level of accountability. So I had these two very contrasting cases. But in all of my work in these peace processes, my focus has been in trying to think in the most creative way about how to take account of victims, how to bring a certain bigger picture that you have to when you're in a context of negotiation, which necessarily means there will be mutual concessions. These are not places where either side gets to impose its will on the other. There are very difficult compromises that have to be made because that's intrinsic to negotiation itself. But again, in these contexts, it's very, very difficult, but possible, as Colombia shows, as a very limited number of cases show, to find creative formulas, but not always. And I think that's the other lesson from the viewpoint of negotiation. So coming back to Ukraine, and again, thinking about the Minsk process, I would say that early after Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, some of you may also recall, some of you in this room may have even been part of some of the early thinking about trying to get a quick negotiated resolution of the war before it basically became, I think, what it is today. There were a lot of early efforts. The parties were meeting to talk. But today, and there was a period in those early weeks and months where I argued, and some of us who were involved in the Minsk process argued, that it was very important to actually look at what was attempted for over 7 years, when on a monthly basis, the Russians, Ukrainians, OSCE mediators, and others would meet to talk about trying to end the situation and bring about some kind of resolution. And very little progress was made, I think it's fair to say, including by the admission, I think, of those who were working so hard as mediators. But I would say that unlike the early phase when, just after the invasion, when, as I say, I and others argued that what took place for over 7 years, it was important to look at that as we thought about what might be possible after Russia's invasion. There was a lot of work done. There was a lot of foundation that had been laid. But I would say, from today's vantage point, I don't think there's any status quo ante to return to. Everything that was done then, I think, is over. And now what's probably going to come, if there would be negotiations in future, will look very different, I suspect, from what took place in Minsk. When it comes to justice, as I said, the perspective that I would offer for debate is that, again, the decisions that are taken today in pursuit of accountability and criminal justice, that there at least be some awareness, mindfulness of doing it, that work, in a way that also keeps open future possibilities of peace through negotiation, which today we know the parties are not active. There are no active negotiations today. And what we also know from negotiation is that what's true today may not be true tomorrow, in part because of the basic theory of negotiation, which is that if I'm part of a war in a case like this, and my calculation is that my side can win militarily, I tend not to be interested in negotiation. But as the situation evolves, either better for me or worse for me, my calculus, my perspective, my interest in negotiation may rise or it may wane. And so just judging, again, I won't repeat it a third time, but the central argument, again, that I would put forward for debate, that's why I'm making it, because things change on the battlefield, and let's not also forget, there have been nuclear threats made. This is not a normal situation by any measure. And it's hard to compare it, I would say, to a lot of the cases that Carlos mentioned, which are relevant, but I think there are different stakes in this particular war. And then I guess I would say, just because again I don't want to speak too long, but I'll maybe just offer a couple of final thoughts about peace, in thinking about the peace and justice equation. However this war might end, and everyone would hope, I think, in this room that it would end as soon as possible, and with, as I suppose, on the most principled basis that we might hope. However this ends, 5 years out from today, there are going to be immense challenges in Ukraine, challenges of cohesion. There are frontier zones. There are going to be contested border areas. There's a disarmament and mobilization process that will be necessary. There are very significant social cleavages. There's a big picture here as well, and justice is going to have to fit somewhere into that process. And again, it's just something to bear in mind. And even zooming out even further from that, Ukraine is not an island. And so as we think about these accountability questions as well, bearing in mind that Ukraine is not an island, you could think about different strands of negotiation and conflict resolution and peace building that may be very important over time, some of which will take place within Ukraine itself, others that may need to take place between Ukraine and Russia, whether between governments or between peoples. And then more broadly, in Europe, there has been discussion of a need eventually for a new security architecture. Again, Ukraine is not an island. So I'm not here to argue in any way against accountability or criminal justice efforts. They're extremely important, but how we organize those is also extremely important today, because they may have significant impacts, either facilitating or complicating or potentially impeding the possibility that I think we need to keep alive in our mind through as much legal and creativity as possible of the eventual potential need for peace through negotiation.
Ok. Muy bien, pues muchas gracias.
Very good, thank you very much.
The floor is yours.
These are very difficult issues. I think we all understand this, and there just are no simple answers. And I think that increasingly over the passage of time, I've sort of come to understand that countries are a bit like families, that things go on, there's good things and there's not such good things, and all families often keep some of the not such good things under the carpet, prefer not to talk about them. Let's move on, let's not deal with them. But somehow they emerge later on in a second generation or in a third generation, and they come back to haunt us. I think this is something we all understand. And in the context of these kinds of issues that we're talking about, whether it's Colombia or South Africa or Chile or Spain or Northern Ireland or Ukraine, there's no simple one-size-fits-all type of solution. I think we know that. It depends on the culture, it depends on the circumstances, it depends on the facts. I have a very wonderful legal assistant who's Colombian. And 15 years ago, in the context of the conflict in Colombia, he was kidnapped for a very extended period of time. So when I have conversations with him about how Colombia has dealt with its past, he's outraged by the failure to do justice in relation to that community, that group that kidnapped him, killed some of the people he was kidnapped with. And it's very hard to respond. It's very difficult to know quite what to say to someone who's been through that kind of a trauma. Some of you will know from my writings, I have a long relationship now with Ukraine. And so I'm in touch with a lot of people in Ukraine. I'm actually in touch with a lot of people who are Russian also, in relation to what's going on. And you can imagine there is a range of different views, and there are various levels of complexity. I think one of the things that I've come to understand when you deal with these kinds of situations is it's very important to see how people from the other side of the debate think about the same issues. So speaking to my legal assistant from Colombia, it's opened my eyes to hear from someone who's been very directly affected. In relation to Ukraine, it's very easy sitting in Madrid or sitting in London or maybe even sitting in Lviv or Kiev to imagine the kind of outcome we want to see going forward. And we are very good at coming up with solutions and proposing ideas and ways forward. Even myself, who's been associated with the idea of dealing with a situation which is manifestly a crime of aggression. As Carlos said, there is no conceivable justification for the use of force by Russia that began on the 22nd, 23rd of February. It is manifestly illegal. It is wrong, it is a crime under international law, and something has to be done about it. But who are we in London and in Madrid and in Washington to lecture others on crimes of aggression. Iraq was a manifestly illegal war. I've been very clear. Mr. Bush, Mr. Blair, Mr. Aznar are responsible for taking a decision that was manifestly illegal. What has happened about that? Nothing's happened about that. There's been no accountability. A friend of mine who's a director of a major museum in the United Kingdom, one of the most major museums in the United Kingdom, said to me the other day, it's incredible, Philippe, he said, we have an association of the great museums of the world. And early on in this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, a resolution was put forward in our association to stop any director of a Russian museum from attending our meetings. Did that happen in relation to Iraq? It did not. Was the director of the Prado banned from attending the meeting of the group? The director was not. Was the director of the British Museum banned? Was the director of the Smithsonian banned? No, totally not. When it comes to issues of justice and criminality, we are absolute masters of a double standard. How much accountability has there been for the injustices of the past? Let me speak about my own country where I happen to live. A country where you cannot talk about the history of Britain's role in enslavement, where you cannot talk about matters of colonial legacy. You know about such things in Spain. I've spent the afternoon having a wonderful conversation with Carlos and with Juan Garces, and tomorrow morning I'll meet with Baltasar Garzón on my next book, which is about Mr. Pinochet and Mr. Ralph. How on earth, speaking very frankly, can we justify, really, Spain pointing the finger at crimes committed in Chile when Spain has done, as Carlos said, nothing about its own injustice in the past in relation to its own civil war 80 years ago? These are the complexities that we're having to deal with right now as we grapple with these kinds of issues. For every person on one side of the equation, there's someone on the other side of the equation. I'm clear that in relation to Russia and Ukraine, what's happened is manifestly wrong and is criminal. And something has to be done about it. I've had very clear views. I would go much further than we have gone. I'm generally, as you will probably know, not a warmonger, but I believe passionately that this situation cannot be allowed to succeed. It is existential in terms of the values I care about. I would have had a no-fly zone, and I would put our own boots on the ground. In fact, they probably are already on the ground. Secretly, there are from various countries people there in Ukraine advising. But I'm conscious also that seen from Russia, the incursions of NATO, the circling of Russia. And that's why, as Carlos says, Putin uses exactly the same arguments that Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair and Mr. Aznar used in relation to Iraq. We will not tolerate having weapons of mass destruction placed in a vicinity of our territory. It's exactly the same argument. Viewed from Russia, I don't think it justifies what's happened, but we've given the arguments on a plate. And so I think we have to really be a little bit humble about how we engage in these kinds of issues. Because frankly, we have very little moral authority to be lecturing others on how they should be behaving. And frankly, we are pretty dishonest about that. We hold ourselves up to a particular standard, and we conveniently forget that we have not applied the standard we wish to have applied to others to ourselves when it suits us. And that is the note that I would inject into this. This is part of a long game. In 1945, something happened in the world. Countries came together and said, it's going to be a different kind of world. We're going to have rules and ideas and ideals and courts and crimes against humanity and genocide and human rights and prohibitions on the use of force. It's only 75 years ago. When I talked to a colleague of mine from the University of Cambridge when I was a young academic, Sir John Baker, professor of English legal history, he would occasionally invite me for lunch at St. Catherine's College and say to me, what are you working on, Philippe? And I would say, working on this, that, or the other. And he'd say, yes. We had a similar problem in English law in 1472. And it took 287 years to sort it out. That's where we are. You know, in these conversations, the structures that we have are in their infancy. The courts, the rules, the principles. And so absolutely we must deal with the issues that Mark and Carlos have addressed. But we have to recognize this is a long game. We are elaborating a series of structures that will begin to enable us to deal with issues of peace and justice. But we know one thing from our own experiences in our own lifetimes. If you don't address the truth of what happened, if you allow injustice to fester, it will come back and bite you on the neck at some point. And so the issue, which I'm in full agreement with Mark about, is how we deal with that. In the case of Ukraine and Russia, it is unlike any other situation I have encountered in which the state, which is on the receiving end of Mr. Putin's largesse, Ukraine, has put the issue of justice and legality at the very epicenter of its struggle from day one. I don't quite know why that has happened. It's very, very interesting. And so all of these issues are in the mix. And generally that's a good thing. But we know also, with the progress that the Ukrainians have made in relation to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and I think the move towards a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, we know that the Russian response is item number one on preconditions for negotiation. All of this goes off the table, or we don't talk. And that's going to be their position. And at that point, there's going to be some pretty tough decisions to take. So sure, peace and justice, but at what price? And what do we mean by justice? And what do we mean by peace? And what do we think about it in its temporal element? None of what I'm saying, I think, is particularly helpful in coming up with a practical solution to a very real set of issues that we will be faced with at some point. I'm not optimistic that it will be over soon, and I'm certainly not partial to a peace at any price type of scenario. I think you've heard me, I've made that very clear. But these are really complex issues, and the complexity is added to by our own hypocrisies and our own double standards. Did the United States deal with its own acts of torture in Iraq, in Guantanamo, in Afghanistan? No, it did absolutely nothing at all. And President Obama, who I tend to be rather partial to, said we need to look forward. We can't have accountability into these issues. What about the International Criminal Court? Has it looked at any of these matters? It has not looked into any of these matters. It shut down an inquiry into Iraq, and it's basically done nothing in relation to Afghanistan. Unbelievably, Afghanistan was a party of the statute of the International Criminal Court in 2002. It had absolute jurisdiction over everything that happened in relation to the torture and the killings at Bagram, for example. Did it investigate? It did not, and we know why it didn't. Because we know where the money comes from, we know where the power is, and right now in relation to the International Criminal Court, again, to speak very frankly, having a prosecutor running around taking photo opportunities with Western ministers of justice as he is doing, accepting huge sums of money to prosecute one side in a conflict, does not help the argument that the ICC is an international criminal court. It doesn't help the argument in relation to a situation in which virtually every person who has been indicted at the ICC is black and from African countries. Black people and Africans do not have a monopoly on international crime. So let's begin, when we're going to talk about these issues, about leveling the playing field a little bit and being a little bit more honest about ourselves and what we mean when we put this issue of justice and peace on the table. If we're going to hold others to the standard of peace and justice, let's hold ourselves also to the standards of peace and justice.
Thank you. Bueno,
Yes.
nos lo han puesto complicado. Los tiempos dicen que deberíamos haber hablado hasta las...
They told us that we had to talk, we should have been talked until 7:30, and then from, well, since it's 3 to 8, we've lost about a half hour, so I am now going to ask our guests some questions, but if you also have questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. You will be given a microphone and we will get to you. But I want to, before we go to the Q&A, if you give me 2 or 3 minutes at least, set the stage once again so we don't lose sight of the Ukrainian situation, the international justice situation from Nuremberg up until now. It is what it is. We have double standards, courts that take 25 years to face problems such as the Yugoslav case, and that's the most successful case after Nuremberg, and the hypocrisy from states, or the need to tackle sooner or later, like Mark said, in countries and in a war which we cannot forget, where, well, at any time nuclear weapons are on the table. So we find ourselves in front of a war which is not a conventional war, which could be catastrophic, and we have to see how we can set the table for negotiations as soon as possible, or how we can get rid of all of these problems. International justice has to give accountability, penal responsibility we need so that societies can move forward. And in my time working in this, justice, uppercase justice, does not exist. We will never get this. Justice, lowercase justice, does exist, but in any case, societies need justice to move on. You can't go from a dictatorship or to war to democracy or peace by flicking a switch without paying a toll and without establishing at least a symbolic restoring of a state of law, without while proving that what happened yesterday won't keep on happening. So the generic question is, could Germany have become the democracy we know today without Nuremberg? Could we have just signed a peace treaty without demanding any responsibility out of the Third Reich's heads and giving them the opportunity to go onto a democracy and posit themselves? Can that be, or are there intermediary formulas between Nuremberg and letting everything run wild? Because our friends mentioned, ironically, what a participant did in our February meeting, an 80-year-old Russian lady who had seen quite a bit when it came to the proclamation of another one of the Ukrainian representatives, who was also very old, and he said, we won't speak until victory, and after victory, then we talk about concessions. And the woman said, what does victory mean? A Ukrainian flag flying over Kremlin? So if that doesn't happen, we have to think of finding a way out for these societies which are so complex. I was in Ukraine in 2017, years before the war, and you could already see a completely divided society. There was no violence anywhere except in Donbass, but the parties we had and the parliament we had, left and right Ukrainian parties, and then you had pro-Russian parties. So how can we find a way that gets rid of the nuclear threat, and for us not to show the same terrible example, and that we forget victims and society must carry on, just sit there and see time march forward? So those